All right, so the Holyoke Canal and its mills is a presentation, and I'm going to go through the formalities in the beginning, but the most important thing is that this canal should be viewed in person to really learn about how the canal functions, its history, how to walk around it, and how to appreciate its mills. Some of the mills are being used presently. Some have been in use constantly since they were made. Others had a point where they stopped, and then people refurbished them. And you probably know that the former Lyman Mill is being used for open square. So we're going to go through how the canal functions and its very many mills. Right, and I've been doing this for 11 years, and every one of those years, the Holyoke Preservation Trust has been alongside me, and they set up a lot of my events for me, get the people there. They are a group that have been around for 11 years also. And they have a website, holyokepreservationtrust.org. They now meet at the building that's on the right-hand side of the screen. It's the Masonic Temple on Chestnut Street. And they do a lot to try to help preservation, but they also have education programs. For instance, they have an annual garden tour, and I think this is the 5th year they have that. They also have an annual art contest, both for children and for adults, and that also is in its 5th year. And they try to help people, contractors, develop homes and buildings to make it historically accurate. And they provide as much help as they can. Now, the funding comes tonight from the Massachusetts Cultural Council. And I also have 3 private sponsors. They're on the sheet that you probably picked up on the table. And we're at Holyoke Media, and they have their own website too. And they have a lot of events here, music and other presentations. All right, and what do? Well, for 11 years, I not only do the canal in Holyoke, I do other communities. And I not only do canals, I do cemeteries and churches and streets and parks and reservoirs and mills. And once a year, I do a house presentation. And I do them in now, I believe, 13 different communities. So I started with 3 communities 11 years ago, but now I do many more. And it's always on these topics. And pertinent to this presentation, I'm going to have a bus tour. As of yesterday, it was filled up. But I'm having a bus tour, and that's Saturday. I also have walking tours. I have 2 in June. I've only listed 1 here. But you'll get to see the mills and also how the canal functions. All right? Not only do power canals, I also do navigational canals. And it might seem incredible to say this, but the South Hadley Navigational Canal is the oldest, the first navigational canal in the United States, built in 1794. Incredible. George Washington said when he was a general during the Revolutionary War, great country, but it's hard to get around. And he couldn't fund the canals because the federal government didn't have much money, but he said, please build them if you can. And the South Hadley one, very close to us, is the first ever in the United States. I also do the Chicopee Power Canals, 2 of them, and I do all the power canals along the Chicopee River, both for presentations and for tours. Now the map you're looking at on the right, it goes from 1 to 6. The South Hadley one is number 2 on that list. It's the first or the oldest of those. But the first place they put navigational canals in the United States was on the Connecticut River. Why? Because remember, New England was settled first, and there was a lot of people here. And they started moving inland more and more. And so number 3 is Turner's Falls, and upwards and onwards. You could navigate by 1820, all the way up to Hanover, New Hampshire, and beyond. Okay, and why is Holyoke so special among all these canals? Well, people always said, even when I was young, they said, Holyoke's Canal and Holyoke is the first fully planned industrial city in the United States. They would say that. And then about 10 years ago, I heard people say, no, that's not true to say that. But if you look at the qualified adjectives, fully planned, industrial, and city, then if you follow what that says, Lowell, Massachusetts was not fully planned. It was planned along the way as they were building it and as they put the canals in. The canals were so poorly put in the beginning, they went down the middle of a street at first because they didn't know where to put things. But in that Holyoke's case, they fully planned it before they even started. And industrials are important because Washington, D.C. is a planned city, but it's not industrial. Now, the last qualification, city, there are other places that are just towns or are planned on a very tiny scale. Even South Hadley Falls was planned on a tiny scale before Holyoke, but it's not very large. So Holyoke is the first and only fully planned industrial city in the world, and I've checked it many times over, and people gave me their point of view, and I always came to the conclusion they must be wrong, because these industrial towns were so tiny beforehand. And you can see on the very far right the gridded section of Holyoke that was planned out with 3 levels of canals. All right, and on bus tours, I cover almost every one of these lettered stops. On walking tours, I tend to stay around certain places, but I do cover them all. So I'll have tours that may cover 6 of these, but I'll have another tour that'll cover the outer 6 too. So I'll tell people it's going to cover the 3rd level canal. And then I do go to South Hadley and cover the canal there. The reason why Holyoke bought the South Hadley Canal and converted it over to a power canal. But you can see it includes dams, of course, and then spillways where water drops from one canal to the next. It's a leveled canal, first to second, second to third level, and second level out to the river. All right, and there were mills placed along it in many places. About 60 of them were along the canal in places where they get power from the canal. And there's one very special one, a test flow, which I'll cover later, but that was a place you could test the turbines that would provide the power. Now, these are the 3 level canals. They're still there. All right, the first level canal was made to be 1 mile long, still there. The second level canal was made to be about 3.2 miles long, and it's nowadays about 2.8 miles long. About 0.4 of a mile was taken off it. And then the 3rd level canal is still there, about 0.8 miles long. All right, and it wasn't always built at the same time. In the red, you have the first development, and that was done by, the Holyoke Canal has been owned only by 3 companies. The first company was the Hadley Falls Company. They owned it for 10 years. 1847, they got the plans and started to dig. 1848, the dam went up. By 1857, they got very nervous. They said, we're not going to make a profit. And I believe their mistake was this. Look how much was dug in 10 years. It's a canal that not only is 5 miles long, it's 130 feet across, at least on the widest portion, and it's 30 feet deep. It's enormous. They have to have a lot of workers dig here. There was no equipment. So for 10 years, they dug, and only 4 companies showed up, right? And 2 of those companies were owned by the Hadley Falls Company anyways.
What do you mean the company?
Mills along the canal, using the power. And two of them were company owned anyways. And mill owners were out in Lowell. They were out in these small towns everywhere around Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the center of the American Industrial Revolution. And companies didn't necessarily want to come here yet because you would have to get workers, a mill built, worker homes built, and you'd have to pay rent for the water use. And this company got very nervous. And in 1857, they sold out to a Holyoke-based company, Holyoke Water Company. And that company would own it for 143 years. So they were the most important company that owned it. And you can see what they did. They added to the canals. Look at the green sections that were added on the first and second level. And then later during the 1880s, they added to each of the canals a little bit. Those weren't incredibly important. Very few mills would go along them, but they did have a few. So this is the development. And this is a map of the canal, both the black and the red. The black is the original, and the red is the addition. It's 4.8 miles officially. You can see where the dam is on the far right. That dam from 1848 is still in the water. It's about a foot below the water surface. It's made out of wood. The masonry dam they started to build in the late 1890s, and by 1900 it was finished. And you can see the different levels. The first level is a perfect horizontal line, and you have to keep the level of these water at a set level. The mill owners, when they took them into their tunnels, paid for a certain amount of water, and you had to deliver that amount of water. You had to keep the level of the water set. And so the gatehouse that you see near the dam could control the amount of water coming in. There was 12 powerful gates that would allow water in, and if they needed to keep the level of water in the canal down to a ½ inch, they would allow enough water to keep it there always. They knew exactly what they're doing, even in 1848. Today, they use computers to help them, but for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's always an engineer on staff at that gatehouse area to make sure that the water is still at a set level. All right, and this is the Holyoke Dam that was wooden that's still out there. That gatehouse is in its third edition. Across on the South Hadley side, which for you would be on your far right, the Holyoke side would be on your left. The South Hadley also had two gatehouses. They were smaller because Holyoke entities bought the land for the Holyoke Canal, but they also bought the land on the South Hadley side. They bought the canal. That was a navigational canal. And for about 15 years, they used it both for power and navigation, and then later only for power. They kept that power side, on the South Hadley side, going to 1977.
What do you mean for navigation?
There was at first a navigational canal in South Hadley from 1794, and that stayed to 1863. From 1805 to 1977, there was a second canal right alongside it, so they were paired off. Later, they would break down that separation, and they'd become one. So they have both a power canal, but before that, the South Hadley Canal was only a navigational canal, and boats would go in locks and rise up above the dam's level and keep going inland, and they wouldn't come out till they're about at Brunel's Marina. Okay, now, there are many attempts at a fish lift. You probably know about the 1955 elevators great successes. They're still there. And they're required by the federal government because you cannot block aquatic life of any type. You have to do surveys in the water above the surface of the dam and below downriver and make sure that the amount of life forms of all types, all species, are the same on both sides. You have to allow them to get through. And they do a great job. You know about there's 2 fish elevators there. And that's the 3rd attempt at a fish elevator on the Holyoke Dam. The first 2 attempts were on the South Hadley side, and they were flops. The fish did not want to go in them. They were diagonal pieces of wood, and Turner Falls still uses the same setup. The doors work, but South Hadley side never worked. Until 1955, the first fish elevators in the world were designed by workers from the Holyoke Power Company, and they're still there and still operating. And that includes all kinds of aquatic life, which means fish, but it also means eels, and it also means insects. So if there's certain insects that want to be in certain soil and they're found in this area, you got to make sure that they like to breed on both sides. There's even one mussel that comes into the canal, and it's found only 3 places in the world. And the Holyoke Canal system has to make sure that it's called a yellow lampshade mussel. They have to make sure that it has a place in the canal. When they lower the level of the canal for 2 days for maintenance every year, they have to make sure the mussel has a place to go in the soil. And they do a great job with that too. Okay, so the gatehouse, the original gatehouse looked like this. It's still a gatehouse there. It has been replaced 3 times. So the outer gatehouse there now is metallic. This is a brick one. And you notice a rack and pinion system on your right. That rack and pinion system has been changed 3 times, but it's still rack and pinion. And it lifts powerful gates, 12 of them. And if you go through and count them in this picture, there are 12 as you go through. And you can imagine on a very, very busy day on the canal 120 years ago, how much water they let through. But always, they kept the canal to within a ½ inch. All right, and this is just beyond the gatehouse. This view, if you go to Pulaski Park, there's 3 view sections in Pulaski Park, indentations in the wall. If you go to the rightmost one, the one that you go very close to where Monte Della Rosa School is, walk to the edge and look down. You see this. Now, this is from a picture from 1876, but if you go there, the canal is still the same. There's no longer mills that you see on the outer right. Your left. There's a few mills there. Those are gone. They replaced them with solar fields. But this is still a view you'll have. All right, and along the way, they made 6 spillways. The water has to go from one level of the canal to the next. So when the person that designed it, his name was Philander Anderson, he made 6 spillways on the canal. So it drops to the next level of the canal, or when it's in the end, near the end of the 2nd level canal, and at the end of the 3rd level canal, it goes out into the Connecticut River. But the first spillway of all, number 1, was put in for a safety valve. And this is the one you're looking at right now is the very last one. It's, of course, still there. It doesn't have that gatehouse on the very top that you see. And on a very busy day, if the level of Connecticut River is very low, that drop can be up to 32 feet. Okay, and these are the pictures of the 6 spillways. 2 of them are gone. Spillway 1 is gone. Old Spillway 5 is gone. But the others, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are still there. And even though very few mills use hydromechanical power anymore, canal power anymore, Holyoke has 4 power stations on the canals. And where are they? They're at the locations of spillway 2, 3, 4, and 5. 4 is the oldest one, made in 1895. Okay, and this one is one that's down Gatehouse Road in Holyoke. This is a modern view of it. It's called Boat Lock Station. And its last use, 3 uses. Its last use has a spillway to drop water onto turbines. There's 5 medium-sized turbines inside of here. So at the dam, you have 2 enormous turbines. And if you go to the fish lift, you'll hear those 2 turbines. But Holyoke has 4 medium-sized stations with a total of about 14 medium-sized turbines. And this is one of the bigger ones. And at those locations, they make electricity. So the canal makes electricity. It makes as much electricity as the dam does. The dam makes 25 megawatts of electricity on its best day. The canal also makes 25 megawatts of electricity. And that's pretty much the only reason they keep the canal going. For historical significance, yes, but also to make electricity. Okay, and this is another one of hydroelectric stations. This was the old test flume. They used to test almost every turbine that was designed in North America. They would bring on railroad tracks into Holyoke and test it here. It was the best turbine test location in the world. And this was the second one they ever built. From about 1880s to about the 1940s, Holyoke was the best test flume area for turbines. And this building is still there. They don't test turbines anymore. They make electricity. And you can see this from Ray Street, a little past Cabot. Okay, and this is showing you an old view of it when it used to test. It used to bring the turbines into this door and test them there. Okay, so I'm giving you another map of where the canals are, and I'm showing you other entities besides the spillways. One is a test flume I just mentioned. You can see that on the top test flume, point to that location. But 2 other things you need are you need an administration center, and the administration center used from about 1870 up to today is still there. It's at the very beginning of Canal Street and Ray Street, at the very start of where Main Street is, next to an old fire station. And that building has been in use for a very long time, has that. The original administration center that they used for the first 25 years is gone. But the second one is still in place. Now notice the last thing I have here, Hadley Falls worker homes. If you're a canal digger, you cannot afford to come into a town like Holyoke in 1848 and get an apartment for yourself. So the Hadley Falls company, who owned the canal, had worker homes. And they had them in 2 locations. The location I'm showing here, which is on Canal Street near Lyman Street, are the original homes from 1848. They're still there 180 years later. They look very much like worker homes in Chicopee because the same 2 men that designed, managed, and dug this canal also had the Chicopee Center Canal made. And so they designed homes just like in Chicopee. They're still here, but they used to be another set. And they were on upper part of Lyman Street near High Street. They're now have been taken out in 1935 and replaced with Lyman Terrace. Sadly, if you could have seen the originals, they would have looked a lot better and more of them. But there were a lot of workers. And the South Hadley side was very similar. 3 big mills. 2 of them are shown here. worker homes all over the place, owned by Holyoke. 2 canals there, 2 gatehouses, same dam, push water into the Holyoke Canal, push water into the 2 South Hadley canals. Okay, and this is that Hadley Falls Administration Center. The Holyoke Water Company would be there. Nowadays, it's 2 stories high. Back then, in 1876, when this picture was made, it was 1 story high. Same building. They cut the top floor off here, lifted it up about 15 feet, and put a second floor into place. And these are the 4 big names in the history of the canal, by far. John Chase, he was the absolute man in charge. He designed the Chicopee Center Canal. He lived in Chicopee. He came every day into Holyoke for about 10 years, and he was the man in absolute charge of the management and design. Charles McClellan was his guy in the spot to get the workers to dig, to build the walls, to build all the buildings they needed. Philander Anderson was the guy who designed it. He was a civil engineer. And Clemens Herschel was the man that made the second dam, the masonry dam that you still see in place. Okay, and these are the Hadley Falls worker homes. 5 of the 6 rows on these city blocks are still in place. Most of them are owner-occupied. And they are gorgeous on the outside because they made them to look like the original. Now, what about all these mills? In 1848, in Lowell, they were using only metallic turbines at the end of tunnels from one canal to the next, bringing the water in fairly horizontally, about a 1-degree drop of water. But when you got to the engine room, the water would drop mostly vertically onto these metallic turbines, turn them about half a revolution per second. That turbine would spin, it'd be hooked up to pulleys and belts and to wheels. In a big mill like the Lyman Mill or the Far Alpaca, you would have 2,000 to 3,000 workers. You would have about 1,000 seamstresses on 2 different shifts. That means any shift would have maybe up to 600 seamstresses going. They each needed to be hooked up with belts and wheels to their sewing machine, because these mills made finished products too. And you would all get them from this hydro-mechanical power. Hydro, water, mechanical motion. The motion of water would turn a turbine, would then turn every apparatus in a big mill. The big mills, like the Lyman, would have 12 tunnels and 12 enormous hydromechanical turbines. And this is one that happens to be one that takes the water in horizontally, but that's fine. You can then shoot it downwards onto these turbines. Okay, so the rest of the presentation is about mills. The white and paper mill number 1. Partly still exists. It's the other side of Lyman Street compared to the open square. Only a piece of it still exists. But William Wyden was opened up a mill number 1 about 1858, I believe, and a mill number 2 in 1827. In that mill, he would attach to the Lyman Mill. The Lyman Mill was already enormous. And then a mill number 3 in Wilbraham. He would become the number 1 biggest paper maker in the United States for a very long time. Even beaten the number 2 paper mill in the United States, which was also in Holyoke, which was the Parsons paper mill. Right? In the white and paper mill that he built up and up, and this is his number 2. It's actually attached to the Lyman paper mill. Okay, and his competitor, older, the first paper mill in Holyoke, started up in 1853, and he would have 2 gigantic mills. One along only a quarter-mile past the original gatehouse, and the other one, Parsons number 2, would be on Sargent Street. Now, Parsons number 1 is long gone, but Parsons number 2 was still around, and up to about 22 years ago, it was still used. And then they closed it, and then about 4 years after they closed it, someone decided to burn it illegally. So they got into it and they burned it. So there's still part of the Parsons 2 around. It's been made into another building, but it's only about a quarter of the size that it used to be. Now this is showing you a lot of the pink area are the mills that are being built on the canal. Look how many there are. And they had to be, in the beginning, I like showing this because every one of these mills had to be between 2 canals or between a canal and the river. So every one of the pink markers, almost all of them, are between canals or between a canal and the river, no matter where you look. So there's a lot in between the first and second level canal, loads of them. There's a lot in between the third level canal, which is the piece of the canal to your left in the river. And those mills had 32-foot drop of water. And so the mills that needed an enormous amount of power in a small space, and only have a few workers, what did they make? Well, they didn't make fiber or paper. They made cardboard. Cardboard production is very, very energy intensive. And so they tended to go down by the third level canal. Also look to the very far right, and you see the elbow or the turn of the second level canal. The second level canal is the big one that's below the first, which is high up. And there, you have to be near the river or near another canal. And so this design was very sly because if you look at it carefully, and I'm going to move finally. Look right there. You had to be between a canal and a river, or 2 canals. And are they between 2 canals? They're between the second level canal and the start of the third level canal. Okay? And they were very sly because this is the only time they ever made a spike off of the 3 canals. So there are 3 level canals, but one of them, the third level canal, has a little spike at its start. Right here. And so that third level canal is a little bit longer. And all those pink mills around that node are taking in water from either the first level canal, bringing it down to the second level, and then right away they're taking the water and bringing it through the mills there. It tends to be the Merrick mill, and they put it into this little spike, or they bring it all the way into the second level canal and put it through mills there. So they're very ingenious there. And that place is the least known place on the canal system. It's also the place where most of the mills are gone. It's empty. But it used to be one of the most important places on the Holyoke Canal system.
What streets are near there? I couldn't really read them. What streets are there?
Oh, it's now called South Ray Street. which is an extension, not connected to Ray Street, but an extension of it. It's also very close to the lowest part of South Street. South Street in Holyoke is where a lot of homes and businesses are, but if you follow it carefully, before it can get onto High Street, it actually cuts downwards, sharply to the right. That is South Street. And it keeps going down to Main Street. And that's where that node of businesses lies along. Okay, so a lot of mills, the Union Paper Mill, which started in 1870 as the Connecticut River Paper Mill, it still exists. And every time I go by the canal in that place, they're still very, very busy. It's called the United Folding Box Company. The first floor of both parts of itself are still used. Incredible so. The Valley Paper Mill is still there. It's where Meals on Wheels is located. I think it has an official name, Elder Care Center. Mass Elder Care. It was made in 1866, and it was built up larger. The original building is still there, hidden inside of much larger additions put onto it. It's very obvious where it is because the Vietnam Veteran Bridge is right there. The Dean Pump, up till about 8 years ago, it was very obvious where this building was. For most of you, it was called Worthington Pump. It started in Holyoke, 1875. They made pumps of every kind, including pumps that push air, but also pumps that push water, including pumps that push water in or out, and of every kind, of every sort. They were the biggest pump maker in the United States. They were enormous. They were along the Canal Street with a long mill. When I was young, I went to the Immaculate Conception school, and right across the street was the beginning of Worthington Pump. And the very end of it was like a third of a mile in the other direction. It was enormous. So he was a machinist? All right, the Massasoit is still there. And it's very obvious if you go to Holyoke Heritage State Park and just go to the place near the canal, look across, and you'll see the Massasoit. It's been there from 1873. It still looks the same 152 years later. It's not occupied, but they want to have occupants. The Prentice Wire Mill, there are two mills. The first one is the parking lot where the teenage edition of Girls Inc. is located. I think there's an electrician business there too, but it's just a parking lot. But mill number two is across the canal, very close to Holyoke Heritage State Park, right across Dwight Street from the Volleyball Hall of Fame. That is George Prentice Wire Mill number two, made wire of all type, of all uses, not just electrical wire, but piano wire. Wire that, they didn't make the wire for the Golden Gate Bridge, but they made similar wire for other bridges. So all kinds of wire. And the Albion, which until 6 years ago was still here. It was my favorite mill. It was quite gorgeous. It started looking like what it had there, but it grew, it took that mill down, and made a beautiful double mansard mill for itself, and it made book paper. Book paper.
Your great-grandfather worked there.
Did he? Did he work? Did he work there when it was called the Brown Mill, or did he? Okay, a very long time ago. Yeah, great-grandfather. Okay, and this is the Baby Holbrook Paper Mill. Beautiful nowadays because it's right near the pedestrian canal walkway bridge. It's visible from Ray Street or Dwight Street. Nowadays, it's a dispensary for marijuana. Back in the day, it was owned by Jared Beebe and then his son, Arthur Beebe. And that's important because Arthur, not only ran 2 mills, he also built what's called the Maplewood Hotel, which is still visible from the old side of the Holyoke Library. And he only built it for one reason. He built it so that his many friends around the New England would come live near him. And so the hotel was filled with his friends. So he'd be a mill owner by day, and then he'd host people at night. But not to party. Because what did he do there? He also started up what's now called, I think, the Holyoke Creative Arts Center. It actually is like 120-something years old. He started in that hotel. All right, the Hadley Cotton Mill, which is like the third oldest mill in Holyoke, still there. The worker homes are still there, like I showed you. Its administration center is the Hadley Printers. Its main buildings became a marijuana mill. They left last year, but it's still there. The Riverside Paper Mill, they had 3 mills going. Number 2 still exists. It also is a dispensary. And they were one of the biggest paper mills in Holyoke by the size or the amount of workers they had, because they made very fine paper. The Massachusetts Screw Company, long gone, owned by the Newton brothers, who were the richest family in the history of Holyoke. Not the Skinner family. It was the Newton family. And they owned, made, managed, or financed about 31 of the 80 mills that would be in Holyoke. So I've met, yes. Some of the Newton family still lives in Holyoke, some in South Hadley. And this is one of their mills. And they didn't make metallic screws. They made wooden screws. All right, the Crocker Paper Mill. It was still there until 4 years ago, when it was right beyond the Valley Paper Company, and they finally took it down. And the Crocker Paper Mill was made by the brother of the person that made the Power Canal in Turner's Falls. All right, now one of the biggest set of mills in Holyoke, the Merrick Thread Mill. At its peak, the Merrick made 1 million miles of cotton thread per year, all in Holyoke. That's enough to go to the moon and back, and then to the moon and back 4 times. Can you believe it? How much thread? Now, he made so much thread that he bought a forest in northern Maine. He made a spike of a railroad from his forest to the main railroad tracks in Maine. And he brought all the lumber down here. He had a lumber yard that his cousins would run, John Merrick, and they would make the spools and bobbins that he needed, because 1 million miles of thread would take a lot of wooden bobbins, and no one could keep up. And so he got into that business and made so many that he sold bobbins to other mill owners around the United States. Now, 3 of the 4 mills are still in Holyoke. Mill number 1 and 4 are across the street from each other on Main Street. To locate them, think of where the haunted house is in Holyoke. It's called the Bostine Building. It's on the part of Main Street that is very close to Franklin and Sargent. And a part of one has been made into a haunted house. But the ground floors are both of them are still used. Number 2 and 3, number 3 is still there. Number 3 is across the canal from Holyoke Heritage State Park towards the side which is Appleton Street. The Lyman Mill is the first mill ever made on the Holyoke Canal system. There were mills in Holyoke before that. They probably date from the 1820s and 30s, but they were made on a canal that is no longer there because they dug over it with an enormous canal. And the Lyman Mill was the first canal. It was company-owned canal, and it is still there. Its worker homes are gone. Notice on the right-hand side of both those buildings, you see racks on the outdoors outside the windows. See those racks? They could put their cotton, which might be still a little damp from during this production process, they could put them out those windows to have them dried out. And the bolts for those racks are still on the side of the mills. And notice also the tower on that first one. That's not a tower for show. That's a tower for a large bell. Now, workers coming to Holyoke, living in the worker homes of the Lyman Mills, could not afford alarm clocks that you could wind up. There's no electricity, so you have to wind up. They could not afford that. So they would be awakened by the Lyman Mills bell. And they would come to the mill on the sound of a bell. They would leave on the sound of a bell. All right, the Holyoke paper mill, long gone. It used to be at that node by the second and third level canal, 1857. I believe this is the fourth oldest mill ever made in Holyoke. Now this one's very familiar, the Skinner Silk Mill. A very sad story. About 200 people died in Williamsburg and in the Leeds and Florence section of Northampton about 150 years ago. William Skinner had his mill up there. It was called the Unkelmunk Mill, made silk. And he would be the only mill owner in Williamsburg to come down to Holyoke. He would open up a silk mill here. 30 years ago, that silk mill was still there, but sadly, it's gone. His mill number 2 is still there. It's just beyond Appleton Street, beyond the police station. It's now a U-Haul storage site. That was his mill 2. His mill number 3 was enormous. It was the full length of Holyoke Heritage State Park, from Appleton Street to Dwight Street. The Volleyball Hall of Fame and Children's Museum in Holyoke take up 1/4 of that mill. The other 3/4 burned in an enormous fire in 1982, also set by arson. The only reason why the Volleyball Hall of Fame section and the Children's Museum section were saved is because they used to store dangerous chemicals in there. During the day, they shifted from natural silk to artificial silk from 1930s onwards. They built the walls with reinforced metals. The fire could not get in there. It saved the mills, that part of the mill. All right, the Springfield Blanket Company. What did they make? Blankets, yes. But they made blankets not for people. They made blankets for horses. And they came to Holyoke in 1873 from Winchendon. Warren Wilkinson would open up a new mill here, expand into the mill next to it. He would become the biggest horse blanket maker in the United States. He would make about 20 million blankets within 10 years, every 10 years. He would, at peak, make 2 million blankets a year. On average, you'd make at least 1 million blankets a year, right? But his peak contracts came after the Civil War because the army stayed very large. And the army was on horse. So he got these big contracts. After about 1900, they still existed. His nephew ran it. He had died in the 1890s. And one of his storage sites is still there. Most of it was taken down in 1935. Now, you would know him in a different sense. Warren Wilkinson moved up from Springfield, and he made a farm that he called Brightside. When he died, he sold it to the Springfield Catholic Diocese. They bought it and turned it into 3 orphanages, 2 old age homes, 2 mother homes, 2 cemeteries, and a big farm, 1 large convent.
That was a lot of property.
That was a lot of property. And so much property that they sold pieces of it to the Holyoke Mall. So much property that when the Holyoke Hospital, the Providence Hospital needed a new home in 1958, they moved up from downtown Holyoke to the home of the Sisters of Providence. And so large that they could even sell or give off land for free along the river. And now it's run by a couple of entities down there. So Brightside was the home of Warren Wilkinson. Why? Because he made horse blankets, and he grew up on a farm. He loved horses, and he made a horse and cattle farm for himself. He was very rich, and he made show horses, show cattle, but he also he loved to experiment. He made silos, and he made special silage that could feed cattle to get fatter and fatter. And he had 1 cow called Cicero, and it was like the fattest cow in New England. And he'd show it off all over New England as a show cattle.
Could the thing walk?
Yeah, it can walk, yes. All right, and this is one of his products. A woman about 5 months ago wrote me by email. She says, I see you have a website that features Springfield Blanket Company. And she said, I have a blanket. I want to send it to you for free. She spent about $70 to ship it to me from California. It weighs about 18 pounds, but it's a horse blanket for a workhorse. And you tie it around the horse with that strap on your left-hand side. And it fits over the entire big couch I have, and it's about 8 feet long on the shorter end, too. But I gave it to the Holyoke Preservation Trust, and I'm going to do a special presentation this year. Every year, I do 1 special mill presentation. Last year was a Skinner Silk Mill. This year will be the Springfield Blanket Company and Brightside together because they're united. All right.
Did you mention when the Springfield Blanket Mill shut down?
It sold off his property in 1935. It probably shut down for good in 1930 when Edward Wilkinson, his nephew, died, and it was sold off. By then, of course, the population of horses in the United States had dropped. In 1900, there were 60 million horses in the United States, 100 million people. So there's almost as many horses as people. In the year 1915, the Model T came around. By the year 1920, there were 1 million horses left. They were gone. So that's an enormous change in society. It's very similar to cell phones. When they came around, out goes the old-time phones. All right, so many other mills were around. The Hampton Cotton Mill in 1853 would change over into, in 1888, the McIntosh Cotton Mill. A former worker would buy it out, and they would make basically one product, and that were men's fine suits. The Far Alpaca Woolen Mills would make one product, alpaca wool. They would have contracts with Peru to have the wool of the alpacas shipped up by ships to Holyoke, and they would make alpaca wool. Why? Because a sheep's wool is not 100% impermeable to water. But alpaca wool, 100% of the water that hits it flows right off it. That's very important because their biggest contracts were military. If, say, during World War I, you're in the trenches, you could have the men wear alpaca wool for their suits, and they would not get wet. And thus, they would not get cold, because wet means cold also.
My great-granduncle worked there.
I believe because they were the biggest mill by amount of workers at any one time. They employed 3,000 workers, 2,000 workers on the first shift, 1,000 on the second shift. By Massachusetts law, a mill could not have a third shift. If they did, they would have more workers. So they employed 3,000 people in any given week. The Newton Paper Mill, still there, owned by the Hazen family. The Newton family made all these mills around Holyoke, but they also had their own, including the Warrigon, the Newton, the Chemical. And you had one guy in the family build them, another guy in the family financed them, another person managed them. The Germania Wool Mill, these two brothers, Strudersberg, came from Germany in 1865. And they opened up Germania Mill. And
Did they have workers' houses there?
they did.
Would they have been like down in?
The battleship. You ever heard of the battle?
Yes.
That was one set of their worker homes. Part of a very small part still left. So Germania had worker homes, 2 mills, one is still there. Go by South Street, Lower South Street by Interstate 391. And that building that's still there is Germania number 2. Germania 1 was taken down. White and Wyckoff made, before Hallmark, White and Wyckoff was the #1 maker of postcards in the United States. They also made playing cards. They also made cards, index cards, any kind of small cards they would make. Greeting cards. Why did Hallmark beat them at the game? Because White and Wyckoff was so good from 1880 to 1955. They were so good at what they did. You keep doing what you do until someone comes along and does something different that society could recognize them better. White and Wyckoff made great cards, but Hallmark said, oh, we're going to beat them at the game, not by out-making them, but by promotion. And in the 1950s, people were starting to get televisions, and commercials came around. Hallmark made a lot of commercials. White and Wyckoff did not. People got Hallmark cards in their head. So Madison Avenue was the one that beat White and Wyckoff. But Wyckoff Golf Course was made by one of the owners here. White Elementary School was the land that one of the owners lived on. National Blank Book, probably everyone's favorite business. The 3 brothers that operated this, Town Brothers, were extremely popular around Holyoke because they're so nice to people. And people just love to work for mill owners that were nice to them. They still exist in a sense that they've been absorbed, but their product line still exists under Avery Dennison. So it moved to Chicopee, then it moved to Matamoros, Texas, and then they moved across the border to Mexico, but they still exist in some sense. Okay, so if you go on tours, I can show you this picture on your left. That bridge still exists. It's a train bridge going into the Baby Holbrook. They changed it about 10 years ago into a pedestrian walkway on the Canal walk. With about $1 million, they made it into a pedestrian bridge over the canal. Gorgeous. And this area around this part has had a renaissance about 10 years ago because of this. There's an older part of the walkway, brick walkway, across the canal from Holyoke State Park, between the Warrigon, Massasoit, and Merrick 3. A third edition of this is coming around, where it's going to start from the second walkway, which is basically at the corner of Appleton and Race. They're going to go up to Cabot Street, along Race, take a left onto Cabot, go all that way up to the Willimancy Bridge with a walkway. They're going to make the arch bridge over the Third Level Canal beautiful. And they're going to narrow Cabot Street and widen sidewalks and make it brick. They have the plans ready, and they're telling workers of Holyoke Gas and Electric to make room when they dig, and they're digging down that area, because in a couple of years, it's going to start.
Really?
Yes. The federal government's budget is being contracted, so I'm not sure. This is a beautiful look at one building. You can't tell what it is, but that's fine. It's the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computer Center, the most powerful computer in the United States east of the Mississippi. But you can see the renaissance that this whole area has become. There's been great changes. And so I thank you with that, and I hope you understand a lot. And if there's questions, again, you can get the mic over there, ask me questions. And I also thank the viewers that will watch at home on the cable access channel, and it'll be linked from my website too. So any question?
You spoke of many of the mill owners, where they came from, but were there a lot of mills that started up in Holyoke?
A lot of them did start up in
Okay.
Holyoke. So there's only a few that came from elsewhere. So the big ones were started up by the Hadley Fowles company in the very beginning, the Lyman and the Hadley. But others would get the idea, let's grow here. The Parsons was the only mill pre-canal to be here, but he grew here. The Holyoke Paper Company grew here, Riverside, right? A lot of these mills did. A few didn't. Skinner, Far Alpaca actually started in Canada, right? But most of the business were homemade, and they saw the opportunity.
Were many of these mill owners foreigners?
Most of them were from Massachusetts. And to me, the Revolutionary War did three things. It freed up the United States politically. Everyone knows that. It freed up the United States in religion. Most people don't realize that, but it did. And the third one, it freed up the United States economically so that people, homegrown people, could make decisions themselves. And Massachusetts was the center of that. I believe they were the center of all three of those. They were the center of the Revolution. Yes, Samuel Adams said to King George, I can beat you. Religion is a little tougher to understand, but economically, a lot of people were very well educated in Massachusetts. They said Great Britain might be the center of the first industrial revolution, but the United States can do the same, especially in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. We're smart enough, we can do this. We have brooks and rivers, and let's go to work. And hundreds of canals were built across Massachusetts, not just Lowell, not just Chicopee, not just Holyoke, hundreds, along every little brook they could find. An explosion. And so a lot of these mill owners were from Massachusetts. A lot of them would end up living in Holyoke, and a lot of them were managers too. And that's why you very quickly go from worker homes and tenement homes to, within a quarter mile, into the most gorgeous Victorian homes. And that extended all the way up to Northampton Street. Because the owners, the managers, there were so many of them, and they just got very wealthy very quickly.
You mentioned that
The occupants of the mills today, very few of them are using the hydromechanical power that they were built for. Which ones are still using it?
Okay, none of them used hydromechanical, but in 1895 and then after, a lot of them shifted to hydroelectric. So what they did, they got new turbines that had wire wrapped around them, spinning electricity, or spinning turbines with wire, according to Faraday's law, makes electricity. So they very quickly shifted the turbines to hydroelectric. So I believe there's 4 mills which still have hydroelectric. The Open Square has 2. And so Open Square uses its own electricity for all its businesses. All the patrons there take electricity off the owner's hydroelectric turbines. I think Hazen has 1, and that's in the old chemical paper company. There used to be one inside of Baby Holbrook, but in the last couple of years, I don't see water going through. But I know one was there. And the last one is right in the front lawn of the Massachusetts Green High Performance Community Center. They have on the front line a small brick building that goes up. That's the former turbine for the Skinner Silk Mill. And when the computer center came in, they said, oh, we can use this. And they do.
Hello, sir. I was curious if you had any comment about the Tower brothers. I know they were renowned as the greatest paper mill architects. So
They were.
yeah, it's
So one brother was Ashley Tower, and the other brother, I forget his name, but was more important, David Horatio Tower, yes. There's a great picture of him. I think I put it on my website. But these 2 brothers, they designed many of the mills. And if you could have seen the old designed mills, like the Albion, they had mansards on them. So they came to Holyoke around the same time as the Newton brothers, around 1863. And they started building for the Newton brothers and other contractors. And I think it was mostly Ashley that ended up doing most of the designs, but his brother David started the business, and there it exploded onwards. Now, I wish I could show you a mill that still has their towers, no, but they designed the Valley Paper Mill, for instance. And they designed other mills too, and that seems easy because on the outside it looks like brick. But you've got to remember, these places have to be worker efficient. You have to have certain amount of workers here and there and there, and they all have different jobs. And it shifts. In a paper mill, you want to have the final product in the basement, and they'd bring up the raw material upwards and come downwards. And in the fiber mills, they do the same. You'd bring up the raw wool and the raw cotton to the upper floors and work downwards.
why did they do that?
because the light material up there and then the heavier materials on the bottom, so it's much easier to come downwards with the light things. And so you have to design everything that way. Plus you needed tunnels for the water to come in and fall downwards. So these two brothers had to make sure everything was designed perfectly according to specifications and be safe. And if you go into these very, very old mills, I hear they're 5 bricks wide on the basement. But if you go into the newer mills, they'd be only 2 bricks wide, say. And a lot of the old mills are still there, but a lot of the newer mills are gone. Why? Because they weren't built well. All right, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I want to hear what you would say about it.
I wish I knew what happened to their brothers, how profitable their business was. Did they get very rich? I don't know those kind of things. I know the mill owners got very rich.
I'd also read an old Republican article, and it said that Ashley Bemis was one of the most quoted people in Holyoke history.
Oh.
Have you heard any of this?
No.
No, me neither. I was
Yeah.
trying to find any. So,
That'd be nice to see. But remember that they weren't a construction firm. They were designers, right? The big contractors, like the O'Connells, they were around big time. The Tower brothers would stay with those contractors to help them in the very beginning.
I believe you mentioned in a previous presentation that the Whiting Reservoir was built to provide water for the mills because they needed
Yes.
clean water. Can you talk some of that, when that happened and what mills benefited from it?
They all benefit. Well, Holyoke seems to have too many reservoirs. If you count up the enormous reservoirs only, there are 4 of them, and 2 of them there's 5 of them, and 3 of them are still being used. Right, there's 2 out in Southampton, which goes the biggest of all. It's called the Ty-Carmody. And there's 3 in Holyoke, McLean, the Ashley, and the Whiting Street reservoirs. The Ashley and McLean are still used. Why does Holyoke need so much water beyond the need for hydro-mechanical power? So it brings water from the Connecticut River in for the tunnels. But when you're making paper, you have to have a step where you put sulfuric acid on the paper to break the bonds of the pulp. Sulfuric acid, if you leave it in the paper, would turn the paper brittle and yellow. So you have to wash it out with very clean water. So Holyoke not only needed water for its people, its businesses, it also needed water, clean water, for all the many paper mills. And when Holyoke became the paper city around 1870s onwards, it had to have a lot of water. Hence the need for a lot of reservoirs. So it seems like way too many reservoirs, but at their peak as a paper city, they needed that. And still, the amount used by homes and small businesses equaled the amount used by the mills, which goes to show you what the other businesses were up to. Remember, Holyoke was not an industrial city. It was also a big furniture city, a lot of sales, retails, a lot of movie theaters, a lot of education was happening here. So the peak population of Holyoke might have been 65,000, and that happened in the 1920s. But there's a concept called daytime population. That means a nighttime population is the population that's often quoted by the census. But a daytime population is when you add up all the students, all the mill workers, retail workers, all the people coming in for recreation even. If you count them all up, maybe the afternoon population of Holyoke might have been 100,000 people. And they're all using water. And so that's why you need a lot of water compared to what you might think. Granby and South Hadley, you don't need this. Springfield, even then, you might not need as much because the state population wasn't incredibly high because they had mills, but not incredible like Holyoke. Holyoke just had a lot of workers come in from Chicopee, right? East Hampton, West Springfield, South Hadley. They would flood in on the trolleys and go to work. There's a phone. There's a mic.
In your presentation, you talked about the development of one of the thread companies, and you mentioned that they had bought forests to make thread spools. Is there an approximate timeline? Just out of curiosity.
Merrick came in 1863. And then by the 1870s, he needed that forest. So he started up his own business, the Merrick Lumber Yard. And they cut the lumber for various use, but mostly for spools and bobbins. And so a timeline, that's a start. The timeline for leaving, he died 1902. He told his son, and he had this in his will, do not sell the business to another company I won't mention in Holyoke. He said, do not sell it to them. By 1904, his son had sold it to them. He didn't follow what the will said. So the Merrick went out of business in 1904, and it was absorbed.
Okay, thank you.
And that other business the building's still around, but it's gone also.
You were talking about the water as being the life of Holyoke. I was curious, part of the reason why people stopped opening factories in Holyoke was because of a lack of water, right? Like a lack of space along the canal and stuff like that?
No. No.
No.
There was always as much water as they needed. And believe it or not, one of the companies owned by the Newton had their own reservoir, small reservoir. So it was never the lack of water. Some of the biggest hits along the way economically was when electricity came around. Once electricity comes around, and most towns and cities across the United States would have electricity by about the late 1890s. As a mill owner, you can now be anywhere you want to be, which means you could follow the cheap labor around the United States. And so the Lyman Mills in 1927 moved off to South Carolina. So the first big hit was electricity, because you didn't need the hydromechanical power given by the canal water. You now had electricity. A lot of companies had both, right? They would have electric generators. They still used the canal because that was cheaper, but the electricity was good for lights at night, for instance. It was also good as backup, just in case in July, maybe the water's a little slower. So electricity was the biggest hit. But then another big hit came around, and this one is more subtle. In 1968, a conglomerate in Holyoke called the American Writing Paper Company went bankrupt for the final time. In 1968, thus, a lot of these paper mills had to go off on their own if they could, and a lot of them couldn't. So they started closing down. Now, what caused that to happen? And why was it so permanent? And my theory, I cannot find it backed up, and you should always back it up with research, but my theory is this. Massachusetts became the most successful state in the United States. It used to be the most successful from the 1800s. But then that went away as other places got successful. But in the 1970s, there was something called the Massachusetts Miracle. And the governor Dukakis said the Massachusetts Miracle was making us very prosperous again. Probably quite true, because the income per person in Massachusetts in the early 70s was probably the highest in the United States. And that became a problem for Holyoke, because Holyoke made paper, which is, it's hard to make, and all the products of paper, cardboard, are hard to make. And the United States is still the biggest paper and cardboard maker in the world, not China. But the people that were smart enough to make that paper, when they're going to college, could, as an engineer, look at all the engineering fields. And you have so many of them. You have the big ones, electrical, mechanical, computers, so forth, but you have very fine ones. And who in the 1960s and 70s wanted to be a paper engineer? Not very many of them, right? And so they were losing the people that really know how to do it. And if they did, they didn't want to be around Holyoke, Springfield area. They wanted to be where other mills were out, and very beautiful mills. And they were losing their engineers. But I can't prove that. But that might be the second biggest hit in the history of Holyoke. Okay, any more questions?
Today, who controls what goes on along the canal?
Oh, Holyoke Gas and Electric, which is the third owner ever of the canal system. Goes from Hadley Power Company to the Holyoke Power Company, who owned it the longest, 140-something years. And then since the year 2000, Holyoke Gas and Electric, thus, is owned by the city, and that's for 25 years, which is very rare. Most power companies are privately owned, but this is a power company that is owned by a city. They both own the dam, the canals, and the electrical wire distribution.
But they don't control what goes and gets built along the canals?
Oh, no. They do not control between the canal spaces. It's privately owned, and they can always come in with a private person can sell it. Now, there's no advantage to be on the canals anymore, because you would have to build a hydroelectric station for yourself. No big deal. But out of all the forms of electricity, a half century ago, number one was hydroelectric in the United States. It was the best. But of all those forms of electricity, half century later, it is the lowest. Nuclear, coal, natural gas, solar, and wind are all used more than hydroelectric. And the reason why is they all use chemical or nuclear means, except for the water. The hydroelectric station can only use a push of water, which compared to coal, compared to gas, where you split chemicals, compared to nuclear, where you split the atom, you cannot compete anymore. So why would a mill owner come in and say, I'll make a hydro station, even small, because you wouldn't be profitable for a very long time. Okay? Thank you. And at one time, the Holyoke Canal was the most powerful structure on the face of the earth. From 1870 to 1920, it was the most powerful human-made structure on earth. It beat the Lowell Canal in 1870 when it got up to 100 megawatts of power available. No one could beat it. Coal plants could not beat it for a long time. Other canals could not beat it. Even the Niagara Canal could not beat it for a long time. Until 1920, when the Niagara Falls finally built a second canal, and finally that canal got over 100 megawatts. But since then, think of nuclear power stations, which make thousands of megawatts. So I thank you for coming and for listening on.